The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, present the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World. In this session, the panel of 7 scholars in modern European politics discuss what we've learned about Europe, where we are now, and possible future roles in the world for Europe and the United States.
Welcome to the final session of the Juneau World Affairs Council Forum on Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World. On behalf of the Juneau World Affairs Council, we want to again thank our sponsors and thank each of our speakers for traveling to Juneau and providing insight into each of these important topics. We appreciate you joining us here in Alaska's capital city to stimulate dialogue on conversations on emerging issues relating to European relationships. This final panel discussion seeks to tie together presentations on the past few days and to take advantage of the collective knowledge, extensive experience, and perspectives in the room. Our panelists include Dr. Jürgen Saleh from the University of Washington, who you just heard, Dr. Merj Koos, Professor of Geography at the University of British Columbia, Dr. Wade Jacoby, Senior Fellow and Professor of Political Science at Brigham Young University, Dr. Terrence Hopman, former Director of the Conflict Management Program at Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Svet Derderian, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. And this conversation will be chaired by my former law professor, Dr. James Nafziger from Willamette University College of Law. And I'm sorry, Dr. Maya Cross, Professor of Political Science at Northeastern University. We're so happy to have you all here, and thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Heather. Let's see, is this? Yeah, okay. This is kind of an echo, but I really want to give big thanks to both the World Affairs Council and to the University of Alaska Southeast, among others, sponsors and so on, for this absolutely wonderful, stimulating conference we've had. I hate to leave Juneau in any event, and especially after this very stimulating couple of days here. So I will simply thank, first of all, Chancellor Rick Caulfield for hosting this conference for us, and to the very hardworking people on the board of the World Affairs Council, beginning with the ubiquitous Carl Brodesson, to the tour director extraordinaire, Mary Miller, to my own host, who is the man with the incredible Zoom camera you may have seen back here, Birger Balstrup, and anyway, to other members of the board who have helped put this together. It's really been a terrific experience, and not in least to get to know others, including our panelists in this wrap-up session. You can see that we have a measure, at least, of what was referred to as Franco-Italian elegance, if not splendor, represented among the panelists. And I will begin then by asking each of them to single out a single highlight from their own presentation or their own thinking as it came forth in the presentation. We'll then move on to a second set of questions having to do with the highlights and the perhaps single most important takeaway from the conference as a whole. And then I want to certainly, at the earliest point, or I should say at the latest point, to draw out from you your thinking about some of what you've heard and some of the things you've participated in at this conference. So right along, the rules of the game will be whenever you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, even though we have a certain routine to begin with, please do so by all means. We want to involve as many of you as possible. I think it's really quite remarkable on a Saturday afternoon what a great turnout there is, and it'll be even more impressive if all of you will feel free to participate. So I think maybe on a maybe we should first ask if any of the panelists want to simply add to anything they have already had to say. We're all in the academic world, so we're inclined to go away thinking, oh, if I'd only said that. So if anyone here does have something additional to what to their presentation, now's the time. If not, then I think maybe on a last in as speaker, first out as speaker, we'll begin with Jürgen at the end of the line here and ask the question, what would you single out as if you were to highlight one single takeaway from your presentation, what would that be?
From my presentation?
From your presentation.
Well, I hope it's clear that climate action in the European Union is firmly established. I think we're beyond the stage where we discuss whether we should do something. Now the discussion is about how, who does what, and as you saw, we have a lot of tricky questions to solve, but we have a method for doing that, and we have legislation in place, and we intend to continue that way. So it's really become a firmly prioritized issue on the EU politicians and leaders' agenda. So that's my message, if that wasn't clear enough. Thank you.
One at a time, yeah.
Okay. In my presentation, I tried to complicate what we mean by power. And in my view, we tend to assume that power is national power and military power. And I tried to highlight other forms of power or other ways of thinking about power, and particularly regulatory power and symbolic power.
I guess not everybody was here when I was doing my presentation, so I'll just say that I tried to characterize Germany as kind of emblematic of much of the rest of Europe, with adjustments up and down for different country settings, and simply say that it's a norm-abiding country that's having difficulty with norm volatility. It's a security-exposed country that's having a lot of trouble worrying about the new security environment that it's in. It's a trade-dependent country that's extremely anxious about what it hears from international markets. And finally, it's basically a status quo power. It likes the way the world is organized right now, and is not eager to see it change. And that's why the United States' current policy is so concerning for Germany.
I guess I would say I tried to focus primarily on what's happened to the liberal cooperative international order in the post-Cold War period, and why some of the hopes that we had at the end of the Cold War have not been fulfilled, but also perhaps to illustrate at least some of the things that can still be done to kind of promote that order. But again, the most important thing, it seems to me, that comes out of the presentation and the argument is the role of multilateral institutions, the possibility of creating and working more through multilateral institutions to try to achieve common goals in cooperative ways. And I particularly illustrated that with the role of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is probably the least well-known of the institutions that work in this part of the world. I'd be happy to talk more about that later in the panel, and particularly to talk about one example that a number of people have asked me about, namely the role that the OSCE is now playing in Ukraine, one of the most important crises that we're now facing internationally. We can do that later.
In the age of information, disinformation is a powerful tool to affect political behavior. When the traditional checks and balances in democratic systems are in retreat, when the capacity of civic organizations to affect this information disbalance is being curtailed, we are in trouble. This is the case not only in Eastern Europe, but in parts of Western Europe as well. It's definitely the case in the United States as well. If you look at some recent research by the Pew Research Center in DC, you will see that among Americans in their early 20s, there is a growing trend of people questioning whether democracy is a useful form of government. As the traditional appeal of democracy and the traditional emblem of democracy as something that is good and efficient for societies is eroding. We have to prepare for the world that follows this, and I don't know what kind of world will be after that.
Thank you. I would say in looking at the progress of the EU towards creating an eventual defense union, we can see that, of course, the EU is still a relatively young actor. It is certainly a work in progress, and there's no clear sense of where it's actually going to end up in this process of EU integration. But it seems quite clear at the same time that it's a remarkably resilient actor. So as we observe over the course of several decades and every few years, it appears to be in crisis. The media reports that it's in crisis, it's on the verge of falling apart. But these dire predictions don't really pan out. In fact, the EU gets stronger in the wake of these crises. And so I think it's a hopeful example in a way of what's possible when it comes to human efforts to find ways of cooperating in the international system. It's sort of the most kind of forward-thinking version of this form of international cooperation. At the same time, the transatlantic alliance is incredibly important, especially when we look at security and defense. I think it's probably the most important alliance in the international system. So when this becomes destabilized, there are actually big ramifications for the international system in general.
Good. I have a second question then that's slightly more complicated, and I think we'll proceed in the same order as we have. Jürgen, with your approval, lead off, and that is simply taking account of the conference as a whole. What might be your perhaps primary takeaway?
Well, I actually think Maya Cross made my point that I wanted to make in a way. I think what we have learned these few days through this different presentation on different topics is that the European Union indeed has a lot of challenges, and everything. If you take everything together, it almost sounds too much. But if you take a step back, really, you have to consider always what was the alternative and where did we start from. We have 28 countries, many of them are young democracies still. We have managed to expand the European Union to all these countries, which we have shown are very different in their history, their political culture, their economic strengths, their civic society tradition, and so on. And all these countries agree and regularly meet and talk and try to solve problems, and we have an increasing number of institutions and contacts for that. And it's not only on the top level. Remember that the daily nitty-gritty work is done by thousands of officials, people who come from ministries and agencies across the European Union. And the Bulgarian counterpart meets his and her counterparts from Sweden, Finland, Ireland, and so on. And they sit together and solve problems, and they create networks, and they create a common understanding. So the EU legislation and policy that sometimes sounds and looks very technical, remember the formula, although that is not perhaps typical what we're doing in a way, is these procedures, these institutions, these processes are very important in bringing people together, and it's much more than just the leaders, although that is very important too, that the ministers meet, perhaps some of them every month, and create trust bonds and networks and so on, if you like. So, point is, a lot of challenges, but we have managed to establish a way to try to solve them. We are in continuous negotiations. And for the Europeans, remember our history, 1,500 years or more after the fall of the Roman Empire of wars, we have finally established a system where we try to solve our conflicts and concerns through peaceful means. And that's a big achievement if you take the really long perspective. And I think this is something I would take home, because myself, I started to reflect even more about these different things through hearing these very insightful presentations by the different EU scholars that have been here today, and the other 2 days for that matter. So that's what I take home, and I hope you have had a lot of thoughtful reflections also along the same lines. Thank you.
Thank you. I would very much echo what Jürgen just said. To me, one of the key take-home messages from the conference is that international affairs is a contingent business. Things depend, things are not predetermined, and therefore human agency or human capacity to act really matters. And therefore, if humans are capable for acting, humans are also responsible for their actions. So to me, the conference has highlighted both the capacity to act and the responsibility for actions. And in many ways, in different presentations, to me, the conference also has highlighted that the people who draft the policies, who implement the policies, they matter. If we take human agency seriously, we have to take the people who do the work seriously. And in international affairs, a great deal of that work is done by professional diplomats. And so to me also, the entire conference highlighted the importance of diplomacy. And perhaps last but not least, very much echoing what Jürgen just said, cooperation among European countries and cooperation globally is usually not easy. It is usually difficult, but there is no good alternative. And or negotiation, collaboration is difficult, but there is no good alternative. And this conference, to me, highlighted both why negotiation, cooperation is difficult, it's usually difficult, and why it is also vitally important and necessary.
Well, thank you. I think what the most interesting thing that I learned is that somehow on a beautiful Saturday in one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, you can get this many people to come talk about Europe. I'm still shaking my head over that. I don't know what, there's something in the water. I ran an interdisciplinary center for 12 years, and I was always desperate to get members of the community to come to talks. And I consider it a success if one person came to one talk. Well, having this many people come for 2 days is really amazing. Let me give you a way of thinking about Europe that's a very old way of thinking about it. It's not unique to me. It goes clear back to Clifford Geertz, a great anthropologist. And the basic idea is that we humans live in these political communities, indeed, of our own making. We have agency to try to make a political community. And we want one that is small enough that we can feel community and feel identity, and big enough that we can have wealth and power. And it is very hard to get that balance right. So you have countries like China that are plenty big and plenty powerful, but they have to use enormous amounts of political force to keep the Tibetans in, to keep the Uyghurs in, to keep the non-Han people in. And you have European states that have lots of community and is a strong sense of us going back hundreds and in a couple of cases nearly 1,000 years of national identity, but they're often quite small. Thinking of Berger's native Denmark. These are small countries. And so as Americans, we tend to miss this story because we live in a country that is quite large and has been powerful for quite a long time and been wealthy for quite a long time and has had enough political community. We've had a civil war. It's not been easy. And there's plenty of things pulling us apart today. But the Europeans have come up with these arrangements, these integration arrangements, as a way to manage this, to somehow keep the best of both worlds, to keep that closeness to a community that they know, it's familiar, that they love, to which they feel a national patriotism that they don't feel towards Europe as a continent, but also to act in a continental way. and to bring in other members of the European continent as the Cold War's end made that possible. And so all of these integration efforts, they have a history, they have a biography behind them. And however hard this set of problems is right now, and even if it turns out to be that this is a thing that brings this integration effort down, there'll be another one. Because people are engaged in something that is, it's foundational. We all have to have a political community that that meets certain kinds of needs. And so I think what I take from this conference is that Europe's contemporary moment is messy and hard, as it always has been. And it's gotten harder because one of their biggest boosters, the United States of America, which has always more or less been behind the European integration effort, is increasingly hard to count on as a supporter of that effort.
Thank you. It seems to me that one of the key themes that's run through almost all of the presentations here is the sort of conflict between what the economists call public goods and individual goods, or collective goods and individual goods. That is, between looking for what serves the common interest versus what serves the private primary interests of single parties, whether individuals or organizations or states or even institutions. And we see this debate now, of course, playing out in the United States, and the debate about America first and unilateralism and so forth, which clearly stresses the idea that private goods and individual self-interest should prevail over collective goods and common interests in the international community as a whole, or in regions of the international community, whether the transatlantic community, the European community, or indeed the entire global community on issues like climate change, which perhaps more than any other in many ways crystallizes this debate between trying to find collective goods through limiting climate change and its damaging effects versus the private goods of cheating, if you like, or defecting from these kinds of agreements and trying to maximize one's own self-interest at the expense of the long-term future health of the planet. And in that, again, one of the other themes that has come up over and over again, therefore, is the role of normative values and normative principles in international relations. Norms are not quite as clear-cut often as formal laws. They are often not as specific, but they are supposed to provide guideposts for international relations and for states and other actors in the international community to do the right thing and to seek common interests rather than individual interests. And we face this, I think, though, as the central debate of our time. Some of those collective efforts that we've tried over the last 25 years, particularly since the end of the Cold War, initially did indeed try to create what George Bush called the New World Order, which was to be this cooperative world order from which we would all benefit. This is George H.W. Bush, that is Bush the elder rather than Bush the younger that I'm talking about here. As the Cold War was coming to an end. And we're finding that vision slipping away and, again, moving more and more towards the kind of unilateralism and the emphasis on me first, and, you know, it doesn't matter what the long-term consequences are. How do we get people to recognize and to think in longer time frames, to think about the longer-term future, rather than the immediate benefits from engaging in private individual self-interest, but think about collective interests, which are often longer term, and the payoff is often longer out there in the future, perhaps beyond the lifetime of some of us, but nonetheless, we hope that our children and grandchildren and their children will indeed have a better future than the one that we live in right now. And so the common emphasis, I think, of all of us is this struggle to try to find out and identify these collective interests and to try to build norms and institutions globally that will somehow advance these collective interests and the search for public goods, if you like, rather than private self-interest.
Thank you. In a globalizing world, over the last few decades, it is becoming increasingly clearer that challenges to governance transcend national borders and don't respect national borders the way states probably still wish they would. Issues like climate change cannot be addressed by a single state. Issues of international terrorism cannot be addressed by a single state, even if it is the most powerful state in the planet. Migration flows and many others require many other issues require cooperation on the regional level. In many cases, on the global level, the functional necessity of cooperation is clear to many, but the devil is in the details. How would this cooperation be achieved? The European Union is a beautiful story from its inception in 1951 as the European Coal and Steel Community, as a project for that will bring security on a continent that has centuries of history of violence and destruction. And as an effort to address the various challenges to governance more efficiently, one can feel good about what the Union has attempted to do. However, as Wade spoke about during his talk, the system of cooperation, regional and global, is under question these days. Terence spoke about that as well. The terms of cooperation, the future terms of cooperation, are unclear. The United States is under its current leadership has started acting as a disruptor of international norms. And I think that there are three ways in which people perceive the various statements that almost on daily basis come from the Trump administration. Statements questioning the legitimacy of NATO, questions or statements about potential trade wars with allies, statements about statements essentially furthering the America First ideology and leaving many people confused. One way of interpreting this is to be put off by those, and a lot of people hear these erratic statements and feel that America is losing its sense of course and is becoming different from what it has been as a guiding light for democracy and prosperity around the world. Other people just get lost in translation and find this confusing, difficult to understand, disorienting. And other people are excited and happy about these statements because they see value in what Wade called during his talk the prick idea. He said Trump is a prick because maybe the time has come that a prick will deliver the best results for a country that for decades has been taken advantage of by other international competitors. So while it is confusing why these different how these different statements should be qualified or should be understood, my intuition is that they are actually very normal, and they should not be as confusing to the public as they seem to be. Candidate Trump ran a campaign on the message that he will be a disruptor, and a disruptor he is in national politics and in international politics. He was very honest about it, very upfront about it. He also talked about the fact that he will bring a different culture to negotiation and decision making, a culture from the corporate world. I think that people are confused because they're holding the Trump presidency to the standards of different presidencies of the past that have been staffed by politicians and that have have been led by politicians. But President Trump reminds me, before I became an academic, I was part of the corporate world. I worked on Wall Street in finance. And he reminds me of every single CEO that we met on daily basis at the boardroom negotiating. It was very normal for a CEO when they negotiate a deal, and I've never read The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump, but I would imagine it may say some things along these lines. It was very normal for a CEO to lowball everybody and to come with a proposal or an idea that is completely ridiculous in terms of how much benefit it will provide their side and how unreciprocally good it will be for their side versus your side. I think that Trump does this all the time. He just has a transactional approach to these things. He thinks that if he says, let's cancel NATO, let's cancel free trade, let's do everything, people will respect the position of power that he has as the president of the most powerful country in the world, and he will be able to negotiate better terms for his country. This is why he was elected. This is why many people believe in him, and this is the approach that he's taking to live up to his promises. I don't want to take any more time, but I'll just tell you one thing in 30 seconds. Many years ago, one of these CEOs offered terrible terms in the context of a negotiation, and we had to go back several times and discuss how these are the worst terms imaginable, that they are even offensive and that they are ridiculous, and how can we even be talking about that? We went back and forth many times, but the deal was important. This was a company that you could not negotiate with, the way the United States is an indispensable power in global relations. And at the end, after painstaking compromise and sleepless nights, we went back and we said, with great reluctance, we have to accept these terrible terms that you offered, because you are this indispensable business partner. And he said, well, the fact that I have offered these terms doesn't mean that I agree with them. And he offered even worse terms. So I think that these are normal things in the business world. Sorry, I kind of digressed.
Well, I have the tough job of going last to try to summarize some of the lessons of our conference, which I very much enjoyed. But I think our table is falling apart here. I think one of the key themes is that we certainly live in a globalized world, and even though some countries may try to be isolationist, including this one at times, it's not something that can actually be undone. I think the character or quality of our globalized world may change, but we are inextricably linked. And in light of that, I think what we're observing right now is a heavy strain of pessimism about our world, and I think it emerged before Trump. It's almost in a way popular to be pessimistic, and you see this quite frequently in op-eds, and pundits, people on TV are really pessimistic, and they tend to kind of point out all the things that are going wrong rather than pointing out opportunities or paths forward of what we can actually do. So I feel very fortunate to be at a conference here where actually I think everyone on the panel is relatively optimistic that there are ways in which we can make the world better, and that there are promising developments. Usually when I'm on panels like this, I'm the only one who's relatively optimistic, so this is actually pretty unusual. And I think there is a problem with the popularity of pessimism because of the danger of self-fulfilling prophecies, which several of us mentioned throughout the conference. And I think the fact that we also pointed out the importance of ideas, several of us did this as well, shows that this is kind of the antidote to the negative self-fulfilling prophecy, that when you focus on the fact that we can pursue ideas and that opens up creativity and possibility, there's a lot of power in that. And so, I'm happy to discuss that in general terms, but I think that these were some themes that came up in our discussion.
Thanks, all of you. Let me just say, to pick up on Svet's very interesting comments on politics and Trumpist proclivities and so on, that we outliers know from a past vice presidential campaign that you Alaskans can see to Russia, at least. And we hope that as a result of this conference that you have enhanced your ability to see all of Europe in terms of the specific presentations that have been made and your involvement in it. So speaking of that, now's the time for any of you, and I encourage all of you, to ask what questions, make what comments you have. I'll call on you first. Your hand. Oh, I guess you're in charge of this.
I think you should be in charge. Who would you like first?
You can be my left-hand man here. Okay. I think his hand went up first. Oh.
He's closer.
Yeah, speaking of President Trump, he's kind of been the elephant in the room at this conference up until today. And I'm wondering, this is an administration that's probably the most unpopular in recent memory. Given the way he conducts himself, the articles of impeachment pretty much write themselves. And right now there's no legislative motivation to do anything about that. But after the midterms, that may change. And if it does change, and Mr. Trump goes away, and given that there are no unmixed blessings in life or public affairs, one wonders how the Europeans would respond to this. And I'm just curious about that.
Who'd like to take that? Yeah, sure. Do you want to lead off?
No, I mean collect and get several questions.
Oh, okay. That sounds like a very good idea. So we'll take a second question then.
First of all, thank you very much. I was very pleased to know quite a bit about European Union. And I heard about the European Union, the words such as integration, expansion, and much more. My question is, why does European Union integrate and expand itself by including Turkey? Because it is a non-white country or a Muslim country? Are you afraid of Islamophobia or Turks coming back into Europe? Thank you.
So, Carl, maybe we'll take a third question and then turn to the panel.
Number 3.
What has been the effect of increased immigration into Europe and to the body civil society and body politic, and how it affects the future of Europe?
Okay, we have a diverse set of 3 questions here. Who would like to answer any or all of them, as a matter of fact? Maria, you look like you might be ready, or had the courage to be looking straight ahead.
No, I was just trying to collect. Leaving aside the question of how likely it is that Trump gets impeached, leaving that entirely aside and working with the hypothetical, what would be the view from Europe, there would be a sigh of relief. But of course, as there was when Obama was elected after the Bush years, there was a great sigh of relief. But of course, negotiations continue, right? And all the difficult issues about whatever the trade, the security issues are, will remain to be resolved and negotiated. So then I think the sigh of relief is mostly about, okay, we can now get down to business and actually start properly negotiating rather than wondering about what's next from Washington. The two next questions were in some ways related about Islamophobia, Turkey, and immigration and its effect on Europe. there is, of course, a reason why Turkey has not acceded to the European Union, although it applied, 1986, I think, first, right? So there is a reason. If there is such a delay, there is a reason. The negotiations, so Turkey is negotiating for membership and has since 2005, for quite some time. Well, no, I mean it was later. For quite some time. My sense is that it will continue for quite some time. But in addition to looking at demographic composition and religion and things like that, one does need to look at political economy and just income levels. Turkey's per capita income is something like, I don't want to give numbers because I'm not sure that I'm correct, but it's considerably lower. It's fair to say it's considerably lower than the European Union, and the population, it would be the largest member state in the European Union. Just thinking of the complexities of integrating such a country into European institutions, working with structural funds and all the complexities of the European Union, I can also sympathize why Turkish accession would be extremely difficult to manage. And in terms of immigration, that's the million-dollar question. The effects are just as complex as anywhere else. One of the things I often point out in presentations is that there is that misconception that Europe has historically not been an immigration country, or there hasn't been a lot of migration in Europe. And that's just historically not true. Europe has been a country, a place of extensive migrations, not least because of the extensive violence of its history, of immigration, and today in many European countries, somewhere between 12 to 20% of population are foreign born. It varies greatly between countries. But sometimes from North America, people imagine Europe as being this lily white, people live in their own little towns for generations and generations place. And while those things exist, there are also the cosmopolitan cities, and large percentage of European populations are foreign born.
Not in the least, I'd add, because of the colonial experience and the ties that generated in Africa and Asia and so on.
On the immigration question, just to continue that, you would take from my presentation one thing, which would be Germany needs to spend more at home. So spending on something around 1 million refugees is, nominally speaking, a good thing. Germany has big labor market shortages, so to the extent skilled workers come in, that's a good thing. The downside has been so far that the Germans have been eager to spend quite a bit of money on this, but they mostly spend it on dopey things like putting people in expensive hotels instead of spending on labor market skills, which are going to be needed. So Germany needs to turn the corner on this. It's got good training programs. It's been very slow off the mark in getting those things engaged. And German companies, which have mostly cheerleaded for this, have not been very good at offering jobs or training spots for the refugees and in some cases immigrants who have come in. So I'm a little nervous about what's going on right now. In terms of Turkey, I fully agree. I don't expect to see Turkish membership. I freely admit that I was fooled by Erdogan. I thought that the AKP was a modernizing party interested in European Union membership, and I swallowed that line for longer than I should have. And I had a lot of Turkish friends that said, watch this guy, he's much more slippery than you know, and there's a lot of authoritarianism there, and they were right. And I don't think Turkey wants to be a European Union member anytime soon, and the chances that they will be a European Union member anytime soon strike me as extremely low. And finally, on the impeachment of Trump, I mean, I'll just say that I totally agree Europeans would probably in general heave a sigh of relief. But I think this whole impeachment business would be fool's gold. I just think there is a substantial amount of American voters who wish this guy well and want to see him succeed in his program. And the only way, I think, to convince the vast majority of the folks of goodwill who want the Trump project to work and from their perspective rescue the country is to recognize that the world is more complicated, doesn't bend to our will in the way that we hoped that it would, and that a lot of these policies don't work the way he said they will. That's a longer project, and I think impeaching him at something like still the height of his popularity, who knows, would be a catastrophic mistake.
Okay, let me make a couple of comments again on a couple of these issues. I take your question about the Trump impeachment to assume what happens if, as opposed to will it happen. And in that context, at least, a couple of things come to mind to mention. One is a number of missed opportunities that will be hard to get back. Part of what I tried to emphasize last night was that we had a number of opportunities as the Cold War wound down to try to create some different kinds of international institutions and a different kind of international order. And to some degree, in the 90s, we missed it. We did some things right, but we didn't do everything right. And as a result, there were an awful lot of missed opportunities. If we had that problem in the 90s, we could have that problem after 2018 in spades, of a lot of opportunities and a lot of opportunities undone as well, that could be a result of that. We also, of course, have to face the fact that if Trump is impeached, we still have a Pence administration. And while there's likely to be a little more predictability and continuity in a Trump administration, with respect to the critical issues, it's not likely, I think, to relieve an awful lot of people in Europe and elsewhere in the world who are concerned about it. And then, of course, there is still, the overwhelming issue of what happens if the administration feels it's going down. Will it feel some necessity to create some international incident? People have made the case that it may be comparable to the way in which the Argentine generals, as they were losing power, decided to pick a war with Great Britain over the Falkland Islands to try to save their regime by creating a foreign scapegoat. And we need, of course, to have national unity in response to those British monsters. Will something like that happen again in the United States if the administration feels it's going down? And in particular, of course, again, having just come back from Korea, where the South Koreans are deathly worried about this. That's why they've taken the initiative to push the White House and the North Koreans as well to negotiate with one another, because they know if the two of us get into a war, they're the big losers. 20 million people who live in Seoul, 30 kilometers from the DMZ, are likely to be the major victims. And 20 million lives are an awful lot of lives to put at risk. So there's a great deal of concern there, and obviously also with missed opportunities in Iran, maybe missed opportunities also to take some initiatives because of the whole stalemate involving the kind of confused situation about the U.S.-Russian relationships also seems to me to have complicated an effort to kind of address in a straightforward way the Ukraine conflict as well, which is one of the other more serious conflicts that we're dealing with in the world right now. So, there are, I think, a number of still uncertainties that remain, even if there is a change in the U.S. government as a result of impeachment. On the other issues, Islamophobia, I think, has become a serious problem. In some ways, it resembles the anti-Semitism of the 1930s in terms of how broadly it's affected politics in many, many parts of the world, but particularly in North America and in Europe and throughout Europe. And I might add in Russia. When we asked Russian security specialists in 1996, what is the greatest security threat, they said it's from our Islamic neighbors in the southern parts of the Russian Federation and in the Caucasus and Central Asia who've become independent. United States, NATO, minor issue compared to the threat of Islamic revolutionary movements in our south. And that was 20 years ago. And that also, and of course it was indeed the Chechen War and the alleged Chechen blowing up of the apartments in Moscow in 1999, which was Putin's primary mechanism to gain power, to force Yeltsin out and to take over in some ways. And he's clearly played the build up the Russian history of Orthodox Christianity, replace the old communist atheism with this new Russian Orthodoxy and everything else. And he's done it as a way of talking about Russian civilization and how it contrasts with the Islamic parts of the southern former Soviet Union, including, again, states like Chechnya, Dagestan, Bashkortostan, and others that are part of the Russian Federation, but with Muslim majority populations. So even within the former Soviet Union, or even within the Russian Federation, here we have a potential for Islamophobia, again, to create additional conflicts or to exacerbate the conflicts that are already there on the table. And indeed, of course, even if you look at Crimea, I mean, the biggest losers have been the Crimean Tatars, again, who were, under Stalin, all sent off to Central Asia. A huge portion died in the railroad cars on their way to Central Asia in 1945 because Stalin thought that they would collaborate with the Nazis. At the final stages of World War II, most of them were not allowed to come back until the Gorbachev years in the late 80s. Again, I met last year with several NGOs working with the Crimean issue in Kiev, and I mean, the Crimeans have essentially lost all of the political power and influence that they had. Most have tried to flee if they can. A number of other leaders have been arrested. Journalists have disappeared of Crimean Tatars, who are also, of course, Muslims for the most part in terms of their religious affiliation. Turkey, too, disappointed me. I mean, Erdogan spoke at SAIS about 9 years ago and gave a very liberal internationalist kind of speech. His son was actually a PhD student in our Bologna campus for a time. I don't think he ever finished, but I don't know about that for sure. But anyway, and I mean, in the early years, again, I taught regularly for about 12 years in the conflict resolution program at Sabancı University on the Asian side of Istanbul. And at the beginning, again, I mean, Turks some were saying, indeed, as Wade pointed out, that watch out for this guy. Others were saying, well, you know, at least he is trying to reverse the extreme secularism that, of course, had dominated in Turkey under the preceding military regimes, essentially. And that this is necessary because, after all, again, the Islamic populations of Turkey have been largely repressed and have not been politically represented, and that this is a necessary move. But somehow power seems to have gone to his head. I'm not quite sure why. And also, to some degree, the feeling of rejection. I mean, before Erdogan, I thought there was a great deal of chance that Turkey might eventually make it into the European Union, in spite of some opposition from some European countries. But clearly, there were a lot of people in the leadership who were very pro-entry into the EU. Now, of course, that has completely disappeared. But it's also been a kind of action-reaction process. Turkey's reacted against what they consider to be the rejection of the European Union. The European Union has, reacted to the Turkish antagonism directed towards the European Union. And so this relationship has gotten more and more difficult over time in a variety of ways. That I think doesn't speak terribly well for how things are going to evolve over the long run. But again, Turkey is becoming increasingly isolated in a wide variety of ways, entirely within its region and its complex relationship with the EU, with the United States, with Russia, with other countries of the Middle East. It's on a very difficult path right now.
Who else would like to respond to the questions? Jürgen?
Thank you. Well, I think on Turkey, it's a long and interesting story. I think a few observations. Turkey actually applied for membership in the early 60s. And I think for a long time, Turkey simply didn't qualify. It was not a democracy. Then we had a later stage when Greece had become a member, and then in modern times Cyprus, which were two countries who were, for historic reasons, against Turkey joining the European Union, which made negotiations in the Council more complicated. I think perhaps if you had asked this question 5, 6, 7 years ago, many would have said Turkey is perhaps a lost opportunity. Now, as my colleagues have elaborated on, I think most EU politicians would say, Turkey is definitely not, for all the obvious reasons that we heard about, not a candidate anymore. We also had an earlier period where first France was against, and then we have now problems with Germany accepting, who earlier was quite open but never could exactly perhaps made up its mind. So, you know, the difficulty in accepting a new member state is that you need to have agreement among all the other member states. And for historic reasons, that have been very difficult. That's just an additional reason and explanation perhaps to what has happened in Turkey in the past 5-10 years or so. But I think Turkey is a strategic partner for the European Union, regardless who is there. It's very important for us what's going on there because it's a big country. It has still some history of democracy in that region, and Turkey itself have had to cope with enormous amounts of very high numbers of refugees. So and there are conflicts in the area. So it's something that, like Russia, we haven't talked much about Turkey, but that's one of the key countries in the near neighborhood of European Union that we have to somehow relate to. But again, it's very much up to what's going on in that country. You know, EU can only do so much. So just a few observations, you know, and I have to say that this is in no way sort of say reflecting any official commission position. It's basically me reflecting. I have to say this since we're talking about foreign relations. Now, just a few comments on immigration. How will that affect the European Union? Just put a few things in perspective. Indeed, EU has been very much affected by the refugees and immigration, and there is a very mixed groups, as you know, of the people who have fled to or migrated to the European Union. You will have all kind of different groups. And for some countries, this is a huge challenge. Sweden, for example, during this period when Germany and Sweden and a few others basically had open borders for refugees, absorbed I think in the order of magnitude of 250,000 in 1 year. For United States, that's the equivalent of 8 million people. So I think the simple answer is it's too early to see how this will affect. We can see certain political dynamics in different countries, not only because of migration, but of course, but that's one reason. And it will put certain challenges for welfare countries try to cope with this and integrate them in school and healthcare and all that. So that's an issue, and it's a very important issue for European leaders. But like some pointed out, there have been similar situations in the past when the EU had to cope with also big migration. What is new now is that there are large groups coming from countries and from perhaps economic situations that are very different from what the population had in the European Union. So basically, there is no, I think, easy answer to your question, what will happen. That remains to be seen. It will be different from country to country. But it's a hard nut for us to crack to find some kind of common approach that everyone can agree to. We heard that before. And this will remain to be on the political agenda for some time to come, I think, in the European Union.
At the time of Brexit, of course, there was a lot of talk about the influence of immigration. It was an issue that many said really helped explain Brexit. Maya, you had some really interesting comments over lunch that I hope you're willing to share the audience as a whole on the voting districts in England on some of that. I just found that very interesting. So at the risk of repetition, at least to me, go for it.
We could start talking about Brexit. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a distinction between understanding why some people think the way they do and how significant that is for the future of Europe. So we can analyze and really dig down deeply into why some people have become Eurosceptic, and in the case of Britain, why they voted to leave. Does that necessarily mean it's significant enough to actually warrant leaving the EU? I don't think so. But if we look demographically, just to get to your question on this, I think people basically who were clustered in cities, particularly in London, younger generations, very, very much in favor of the EU. And so you, in the end, have a kind of demographic that looks like many of the retirees. I think the demographic is people over the age of 65 came out in much larger numbers to vote, and they were in favor of Brexit. And they tended to be more in rural areas. They tended to be not affected by something as small as like an actual weather pattern that happened to cause flooding in London and made it difficult for a lot of people to vote on the day. But it does show that essentially, and this was the kind of conclusion, I think, after the vote, that a bunch of people who really weren't going to be affected by Brexit were curtailing the future opportunities of the younger people who were going to be seriously affected by Brexit. And so there was a lot of sort of kind of scolding of this younger generation. Why didn't you come out to vote? Because now all that you face, the idea of free movement to get jobs anywhere across the union, to have education anywhere across the union, all of these things you expected were going to be in your future are now gone and effectively taken away by the generation that is pretty much going to stay in the UK and kind of not be affected by it. In some ways, you could even just wait out some of the demographics and try to see, and there's been talk of this, maybe there should be another vote on Brexit at some point, although the guy who suggested it recently was then kind of kicked out of his shadow government, so it's a little dangerous to have this opinion. But, you know, even though these are important sentiments, and I think it really ties into the sort of pessimism I mentioned earlier, that there is this sense that people are, for some reason, drawn to pessimism. And the kinds of pessimistic thinking that came out of the Leave movement got some people really sort of on board with that when they hadn't really considered it before. And we know after the fact that much of what was said was simply not true. The assessment of the UK's role in the EU to try to persuade people to leave, to vote to leave, was based on a bunch of lies. And so it's really unfortunate that this kind of rolled out this way. But does it indicate that this is some sort of tectonic shift in the EU in general and of mass significance to the future, that the project is failing and so on? I don't think so. I think, again, that would be succumbing to a kind of negative interpretation of what happened, because so much of the lead up to this vote was based on happenstance. There was no precedent for a vote like this, and I think, you know, it gets into a big, complicated issue. I don't want to go on for too long about it, but you know, it really, the terms of the setup of this vote were really sort of something that you just don't see in democracies. Political scientists have long known that when you have referenda, it's very risky, and particularly when you have referenda based on that determine huge constitutional issues, not like, do you want to make marijuana legal or not, but something that's complex, like belonging in the EU, that's foundational to the nature of this country. And then to have a yes or no vote with a 50% threshold is in a way not democratic at all. Perhaps ironically, you might think, because it is a popular referendum. So yeah, I think this was very problematic, and it's more a symptom of kind of what has gone wrong in the UK than anything, I think, more significant about the EU. Referenda really leave the public open to manipulation, and I think that really was the case here.
Okay, before we take any more questions, comments, any further responses from the panelists? If not, I want to encourage all of you, if you'd like, simply to reflect on what you think are the primary takeaways or highlights, but otherwise to ask what questions you'd like. This is last chance for this group of experts on Europe. Yes, back here.
So I guess I want to come back particularly to the first three presentations, which really emphasized strongly about the necessity of norms in order in the new sort of 21st, going in 22nd century to be able to get the sort of a handle on some of these global issues. I mean, and we're talking about Germany and its norms, but also about the EU's development of their norms and so on. And then we have, you know, Svet suddenly throws that out the door in some ways in talking about Trump and what the U.S. is doing. And so I guess I'd like a comment about how do we move forward? Because I agree that if we're going to move forward, there has to be a set of agreed upon common norms in order to move forward. And it seems like, as far as the United States, from what we've had from this administration, we're moving away from international norms. And this, of course, was not about, it was about our allies, but I think if we say about our allies, then we're talking about the United States, so you have to bring back to that whole point that if you no longer share those norms, are they really allies? I mean, and that's sort of where I see us right now in this administration. Are we really allies with the EU? Or is it, if they are, is the EU going to change their norms to a lower bar? I mean, in terms of where we are right now with this administration.
I suppose that question has a lot to do with how we define norms, how we define the duration of norms, how we look at the present situation in terms of whether it's a new norm or just a deviant norm. Anyway, we may be able to get that later. Let's get a couple of more questions then, if we have them. Anyone? One, two, yeah, please.
Yeah, just kind of a procedural question or a logistical something here about, I understand countries can withdraw from the EU. Can the EU kick countries out if they go rogue? Which seems like it might be more and more possible with Putin in charge and making inroads into Eastern Europe. So I'm kind of concerned about that.
Number 3.
Don't be shy. Well, we've got 2 very good questions. Why don't we take those up now? Who'd like to handle them?
Let me just take a shot at the norms one. I won't weigh in on the other one, so we can be quicker up here. But I would just say that the Europeans, certainly the Germans, I'll just speak to the Germans are all in on norms, and they're just going to have to adjust. Trump is, if Dr. Dadarian is right about what Trump is up to, and I think there's no good reason to think that he's not trying to be unpredictable, then I think that people are going to have to hunker down for a while. And sociologists have this thing they call abeyance structures, where things can go into abeyance, things like cold storage. The Europeans are going to put some things in cold storage for a while. But it's not going away forever. And they're going to have to use these norms amongst themselves. I mean, I think Jürgen's presentation just now is they're still plenty capable of reaching out to their physical neighbors and trying to articulate these norms more fully and make sure one another is sticking with them and all that kind of good stuff. And the difficulty is going to be trying to work with the United States of America. And I think it'd be a fool's errand to try and, essentially say to the White House, what kind of norms would you be interested in? Because the whole principle here is I want to be an unpredictable guy. I don't want people to know where I'm going next. And so if you're dealing with somebody like that, we have a couple hundred years of international relations scholarship that talks about that too. It's not a new phenomenon on the face of the globe. And Europeans will use a lot of those techniques, but they just won't be able to really, I think, work with the United States in this framework that they would much prefer for the immediate future.
James, if you want a third question, I have one.
Can I give you the mic
we'll
first?
We'll come to that later, but I want to first address these 2 questions that have come in.
We'll do the 2. If anyone has additional questions, let's get you the mic first.
We've only enabled Wade to make his response, but I'm sure there are others who have a response.
Let me weigh in also on the norms question, if I can. I mean, in terms of the alliance, and you ask about the relationship between norms and the alliance, again, there are things in NATO like Article 5, which is a treaty and legally binding, and in spite of Trump's early statements that we ought to ignore, or just totally ignoring himself in his meetings with NATO allies, any reference to Article 5 implied that he did not subscribe to it. And clearly his military advisors got to him and pointed out that this is legally binding as a treaty that was signed in 1949 and he can't undo it. But around that, of course, are a lot of other norms that are a little softer and clearly where we don't share those norms as clearly. I mean, I pointed out last night, of course, also that some norms may contradict one another. I mean, within the OSCE framework, we have the norms of respect for human rights, but also non-intervention in the internal affairs of states. So, states where the United States criticizes their human rights performance, they say, oh, but that's intervention in our internal affairs. And alternatively, obviously, we say that states that are abusing human rights should be called out. So norms, they're very complex, and we need to kind of work with them. But clearly, we are living in a world in which the norms that the United States seems to be advocating now are different from those of many of our allies. To disagree a little bit with Sven about negotiations and the business world, in my book on negotiation, which is out of print, and I'm working on revising it with the younger colleagues. You can buy it on Amazon for, I think, $1,495, but it ain't worth it.
Is that autographed or no?
No, that's it's probably a used one at that from one of my former students. I distinguish between bargaining and problem-solving approaches even to negotiations. Bargaining is what you do in the bazaar in Turkey. It's what you do in business. It is a kind of win-lose, zero-sum kind of relationship. How much am I going to pay for a used car? And clearly the dealer wants you to pay more and the buyer wants to pay less, and you bargain to try to find some middle point. But that approach to negotiation, in my view, of complex international issues involving norms doesn't work very well. And I think it's far better if we can get people, when they're dealing with negotiations, to create this norm of problem solving. Instead of saying it's us against you, it's saying, what is the problem? The climate is heating up, and this is causing a lot of bad environmental effects on all of us. We share this problem. Or even we're in a war with one another, and we're killing one another, and neither side's going to win this war. How do we get out of this mess? And instead of viewing it as a question of, am I going to win this war, or are you going to win this war, we view it as, this war is hurting both of us. It's a problem that we have. How can we solve that problem together in a way that will, at least to some degree, leave us better off than we would have been otherwise? We may never get the perfect solution through negotiation, but the main goal of negotiation is to try to come out with an opportunity, a kind of solution of how you get an agreement which makes everybody believe they're better off than they would be alternatively. So again, the criticism when the Iran negotiation, for example, was criticized as not being perfect. Yeah, sure, it wasn't perfect, but was it better than the alternative of letting Iran? Iran would have had nuclear weapons by now in all likelihood if we hadn't signed that agreement. They were so close. Is it better to try to postpone that 12 years off into the future, hoping that some change will come about in Iran? Because the real alternative of not having that agreement was that Iran would go ahead and get their nukes as quickly as they could. And they clearly had the technical capacity to have done it by now. So the question, in other words, in negotiation is, how do we solve problems and how do we try to make everybody better off than they would be otherwise? And that's a kind of a norm as well, I think, that ought to apply to almost all diplomatic relationships. We ought to be thinking about what are the common problems that we share? How can we work together in a negotiation process, in a diplomatic process, to make us feel like we're better off than we would have been otherwise?
Terry, I just wonder if an offsetting consideration is that there are plenty of people and institutions that have vested interest in a protraction of conflict, that with all of the techniques we have for resolving conflict, for all the hopes we have that we can nip conflicts in the bud, we have to contend with the unfortunate negative side of it when we start talking about norms. And while I'm at it, just in response to the question, I would say that although one person's norm may be somebody else's abnorm when we're talking about standards and expectations about behavior and so on, when we're talking, as I try to talk as a lawyer, about another meaning of norms that can be identified with or actually equated with obligations, I think it's relatively easy to identify the norms where we've gone astray and to offer some ways in which cooperation, which Terry has correctly called for can help bring us back on the track. So at least when we're talking about something as formalized as obligations, if we consider that as part of the normative order, it's relatively easy to identify where we really have gone wrong. Reasonable minds could differ. Lawyers make their living by arguing with each other, but nevertheless, it's not quite as vague or quite as unpredictable as it might seem. I think Terry wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. Again, I mean, it goes back to my original point. People have individual interests as well, and again, a case like Ukraine that I've spent a lot of time working on, and I spent a long time talking with the chief mediator in Vienna a few months ago in a coffee house well into the dark winter evening and all that, which is largely off the record, so I can't go into details. But clearly, there's a formula that's already been agreed upon to solve that conflict. Ukraine restores its territorial integrity and the border with Russia. The Russians have agreed to that, in exchange for which Ukraine has to decentralize power and create a more federal political system, which is probably actually in the interest of many Ukrainians, particularly those living in Western Ukraine, where they also have a different cultural heritage. In Lviv, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or in Czernowitz, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so forth. The problem is they keep fighting one another. And they can't agree in the midst of this fighting then about how you get to that goal, the formula for a solution that they've already agreed upon. And the reason for that, I think, is the private interests of a few individual leaders. If Ukraine is united and the people in Donetsk and Lugansk can vote, the odds are Poroshenko won't get elected again in 2019. He's going to have a tough time anyway. At the same time, if there's an agreement, the leadership in Donetsk and Lugansk are going to turn into or change from being, their little fiefdoms that they can control to becoming sort of like governors of Alaska or whatever, which is not a, totally inappropriate or unimportant position, but nonetheless won't give them perhaps the access to corruption and private wealth and power and other kinds of things that they now enjoy in these breakaway regions. And as long as you've got these private interests that stand in the way, you've solved the problem in some sense. You've got a formula for solving the problem, but getting the individual parties who have individual interests and who become kind of spoilers in negotiations remains a problem. But again, it's getting people out of this mode of thinking of, what do I gain? And political leaders have to some degree to take responsibility for what's good for their own society as well as what's good for them individually.
Okay, enough said on these questions, or did anyone else? Jürgen may have something to say. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think as a representative for the European Union, I owe you an answer to this very simple and good question, and to my very great embarrassment, I'm not 100% sure you can do that according to the Lisbon Treaty. I would guess yes. I will check that because this is something I should know, and I will get back to you. I can just make the perhaps reflection that I think it would, even if we would have that possibility that the member states can collectively agree, and they would have to do that in unison to expel another country, it would be politically very, very difficult. You can imagine that yourself. And but it's an interesting question, especially in these days where we certainly have countries where we have outright challenges to our Treaty of Lisbon in terms of what's happening of free speech and the rule of law and these things. So let me come back to you on that, and thanks for the question.
Okay.
So what?
Sorry. Yeah. Svet.
A brief answer to that question about whether the European Union can exclude or expel a member state, and I don't know the legal answer either. But what I'd like to point out is that for a member state that does not follow the rules or norms, and those two are different things, of the European Union, there are extensive political costs. It's a political process, political integration, and the costs are also political long-term. So, for example, in Poland, with both Poland and Hungary, I don't think it's possible to quantify how much money, how much business opportunities, how much opportunities in various negotiations they've lost because of their particular stances on issues, but nonetheless the political cost is there. And certainly with the Kaczynski government in the previous decade, the brothers Kaczynskis, Poland lost a lot of opportunities in Brussels for influence, for just having its voice heard. So just last year, Poland was the only member state that voted against Donald Tusk as the new term for the current president of the council, who's former Polish prime minister. And so Poland did decide it's worth for us to take a position and vote against all the other member states. But in many EU matters, when countries dig themselves in like that and they go into the corner, it's very difficult to come out of it. And I think the countries learned that. So my point is that there is a sort of immeasurable political cost that cannot be neatly outlined, but nonetheless exists.
What I wanted to add to this is that so for during the entire history of the European Union until recently, there was no actual clause that could specify the conditions for expulsion or anything like that until the Treaty of Lisbon. So since the Treaty of Lisbon, there is Article 7 that can be triggered to expel a country from the European Union if it is no longer fulfilling the standards of democracy, stability, etc. The issue is that the vote for this article to be enacted has to be unanimous. And even though there have been discussions about the threat of Article 7 in both the context of Hungary and Poland, who, as I showed in my presentation, are experiencing major democratic backsliding, they have each said that they will veto Article 7 if it's enacted against one of them. So Hungary has Poland's back, and Poland has Hungary's back in their attempt to cause democracy to retreat.
And Jürgen has another question for his quiz.
One last thing that I wanted to say about what Terry was speaking about a minute ago. When I made the claim that about Trump's negotiation tactic, I was just not attempting to say that this is efficient or the right thing to do. I was saying that this seems to be the way he thinks. I just. That's what I was saying. He also seems to.
He thinks that way, but the business model doesn't necessarily work so well in diplomacy.
Sure.
And there's a difference between those two worlds that he doesn't seem to appreciate.
Yeah, and he also seems to sideline or remove people who don't agree with his way of thinking on that. So I think it's either his way or the highway.
That may be more his TV experience at work there, The Apprentice. Okay, I think we have just a few more minutes. Carl, another question or two?
We only have 4, so I'd say could we have a final summing up, or if one eludes you, a favorite European fact from your long careers? Would that be appropriate?
Or further jokes from you?
Oh, I think we've had enough of those, but thank you kindly. Yeah, what was your favorite, Carl? No.
Who'd like to take that up? You're sure we don't have time for a question or two, Carl? Here's one back here.
Okay.
One over here, I guess. Okay. One here and then one back here.
So what is the deal between Putin and Trump, and how does Europe think what's going on? And how does it affect Europe?
Yeah, 3 minutes. Good luck. Who was number 2?
Thank you. My name is Alan, and I am the junior board member of JWAC. I am an aspiring protocol officer who lives in Juneau, and it is refreshing to hear the presentation of Professor Koos this morning, especially when she made the distinction of what is an ambassador and what is a European commissioner. And on the latter, I hope that the Juneau World Affairs Council was able to create that environment for you guys in order for you to achieve your goals in visiting Juneau and making your presentation. On that note, I ask that you please introduce Juneau World Affairs Council to your orbit of colleagues when you go home, just so in the future we'll be happy to invite them to speak before us again in Juneau. It's all I need to say. Thank you.
Thank you. You will have a bright future in protocol. So any last words in response to, yeah, please.
Well, we turn the camera off, because I don't want to be accused of libel, because I have my suspicions, but I, of course, can't prove anything, and we sort of hope maybe Mr. Mueller will. But I do think the hint the other day from the former CIA director that it goes way back and has something to do with financial arrangements a long time ago between various financial interests that tie Russia and New York together in various ways. I mean, one story of sorts, in the mid-1990s, Galina Starovoitova was a senior fellow for 2 years at my center. Galina was the head of a Russian political party called Russia's Democracy. She ran against Yeltsin. She came to the United States for a couple of years, and then she became the Duma representative from St. Petersburg. And she came back and visited us at Brown in 1998 and did express concerns because she knew Putin, she knew Sobchak, his boss, very well in St. Petersburg, and did express concerns that he was tied into the Russian mob, and that through the mob and the oligarchies around St. Petersburg, that they were supporting his move to higher power. A few weeks later, Galina and her bodyguard were walking into her apartment building in St. Petersburg, and a couple of gunmen with machine guns gunned them down in a kind of, Al Capone sort of scenario, quite literally, just like, a Chicago mob killing of the 1920s. So, I mean, my point is that I know from some Russian sources, at least, that there were clearly, connections there that were concerning Russians who really supported a movement towards real democracy and also to more gender equality. Galina was also a great supporter of self-determination and particularly for ethnic regions. She was actually Yeltsin's first head of the Office of Ethnicity in the presidential administration of Yeltsin in the immediate post-Cold War period, and was a real Democrat. Clearly, the minute she began to get onto what was going on there, she was gone. When we were in Ukraine last year, we also had a Russian oligarch who had taken exile in Kiev was assassinated actually the day we were in Vinnytsia, visiting this university I talked about earlier. So, but at the Pushkinskaya subway station, where we were coming in and out of quite regularly throughout our time there. So it's become a pattern, obviously. It was a pattern, obviously, when Yushchenko was running for the presidency in 2005 of Ukraine and was poisoned and spent much of the campaign period in a hospital in Austria and so forth. Well, anyway, the question is, as the former CIA director suggested, what does Putin have on him? None of us knows. We hope Mr. Mueller will make some progress on that issue and let us know. But I mean, I at least have every reason to suspect that they've got something serious on him that is far more than a prostitute in his hotel room in Moscow, which is no longer, it seems, a significant issue for his base. And again, his refusal to release any of his taxes or any of his firm's financial records suggests to me that there's something that may go way back to the favorite activity of the Russian mob in Brooklyn, particularly, is investing in real estate and casinos.
Who would have
you know,
guessed?
it's all a matter of, then of making inferences. I don't want to say that I have any proof to demonstrate anything, but there are an awful lot of coincidences, and it's simply a matter, it seems to me now, of trying to put the dots together and see if we can find any empirical evidence of the possible linkage.
Wade, can you give us a last word?
Well, I think Carl asked for a joke, and I think it'd be impolite of us to deny him that. So since there are no economists on the panel, I'm going to give you an economist joke that I think is relevant. 3 economists are hunting, and they're walking through the woods, and they come to we're in Juneau, so we'll make it a ptarmigan. They come to a ptarmigan, and the first hunter raises his shotgun and draws aim and fires and kicks up a puff of dirt about a yard in front of the bird. And the second hunter draws his shotgun up and aims and fires and kicks up a bunch of dust about a yard behind the bird. And the third economist drops his gun and says, "We got him." And where that might be relevant here is, to just pick up on Terrence's point, is there's a story about Trump's finances. There's a story about the election going back to the 2013 visit to Moscow. I don't know if those things are correct or not, but I've already given you my view. I think if this stuff should be thoroughly investigated, thoroughly aired to the public. I think the American people have every right to know all of the dirty stuff that may or may not have gone on. And at the end of the day, this guy has to be stopped electorally. Legal stuff can slow him down, give us a little bit of time. But if we don't get up and vote and organize and do things, then frankly, we deserve what we get.
So, on that rallying cry, I guess we can all get up and go. And thank you very much for hosting this conference, especially the Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, from all of us guests.
The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, presented the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World, with support from AEL&P, Kerr Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight and Associates, Sea Alaska, the Prospector Hotel, and Wastman and Associates.